It's my pleasure to introduce the second panel of the day. We have four guests, but three panel presenters. And our moderator, Heidi Schlumpf, is going to introduce them. But before we do, I'd like to take a second to introduce Heidi Schlumpf. Heidi Schlumpf is national correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. And she's based here in Chicago. Heidi has 3 decades of experience covering religion, spirituality, social justice, and women's issues. She is the author and editor of 3 books, including Elizabeth A. Johnson, Questing for God, published by Liturgical Press in 2016. Also, While We Wait, Spiritual and Practical Advice for Those Trying to Adopt, that was in 2009. And lastly, the Notre Dame Book of Prayer by Ave Maria Press. Schlumpf is a graduate of Notre Dame University. She has a master's degree in theological studies from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary at Northwestern, and she and her husband are members of St. Gertrude's Parish. So, Heidi, I'm going to turn it over to you. She's also my buddy.
So glad we have St. Gert's rep here, good representation here. So this panel is on the new Catholic left, and we got a little description there from Michelle, and many of you will learn more about it from our panelists. So this refers to the rise in the 60s and 70s of the protests, anti-war, racial justice, anti-poverty, that featured many Catholics, including priests and sisters, as well as lay people. So we're going to hear from 3 people who can really explain what it was like, and then hopefully hear from them about where they think this might speak for the future when we have some questions towards the end. So I'm just going to introduce them at the beginning, and then we'll go right down the line with their short presentations, and we'll allow time for questions from you and from me as well. So our first panelist is Shawn Peters. So he was born in Catonsville, and is the author of the book, The Catonsville 9, A Story of Faith and Resistance in the Vietnam Era. So I highly recommend it. I've been listening to it on Audible, and a very interesting story, and he's going to share some of that story with us today. He's also the author of 4 other books, many of them about religion, covering religious liberty issues regarding Jehovah's Witnesses, faith healing, the Amish, and I'm really interested in his new book, which is about a murderer in Minnesota. So, sounds very interesting. He teaches at UW-Madison, the University of Wisconsin, in the Integrated Liberal Studies program, and has done a number of appearances on CNN, PBS, Court TV, Time Magazine, the New York Times. He did his undergraduate work at Rutgers and has graduate degrees from the University of Iowa and from Madison. So I've noticed that you teach some really interesting classes, including one that was written about where you used the television show The Wire to teach about justice and equality in multicultural America. So I'm very excited to hear from you today. Our second panelist is Fred Marchant. He's an award-winning poet and the author of 5 books of poetry, the most recent of which is called Said, Not Said, from Grey Wolf Press. He also has edited some poetry collection of a person who was a conscientious objector in World War II. He's been involved in translating some contemporary Vietnamese poets. He's a emeritus professor of English at Suffolk University in Boston. And of interest to us here is that he's one of the first Marine officers to be honorably discharged as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. So he did his undergrad at Brown University and has a PhD from University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought. He's also affiliated with the William Joyner Institute for the Study of War and Social Consequences at UMass Boston, and has won many awards, including the Washington Prize for his book Tipping Point, and a New England Poetry Club's May Sarton Award. And our final panelist will be Kathleen, who has the nickname Cookie Ridolfi. And she is one of the Camden 28, and so as a college student was part of that action. She grew up in South Philadelphia and is the product of Catholic schools. She's now a professor of law at Santa Clara University in California and the co-founder of the Innocence Network, which is a coalition of these groups that are trying to work on exonerating people who have been wrongfully convicted. She also helped launch the Veritas Initiative, which is a research and public policy program for justice reform that's data-driven. So she has her bachelor's and law degrees from Rutgers and also has received many awards: California Lawyer Magazine Attorney of the Year, Women Defenders Annual Award, and from the ACLU, the Don Edwards Civil Liberties Award.
In the 70s, I kept hearing these stories about Dan and Phil Berrigan and these 7 other individuals who had burst into the draft office on May 17th, had stolen the files, had set them aflame with homemade napalm. Pro tip, if you want to make napalm, gasoline and soap flakes is how you do that. Had set the files on fire, had waited to be arrested, had then gone on trial in spectacular fashion in the fall of 1968 in Baltimore, had been found guilty. Then several of them went underground, most famously but not solely Dan, who mocked J. Edgar Hoover in quite hilarious fashion for several months. And when I got this story, when I got this narrative, it was told to me by the nuns who taught at St. Mark's, who were members of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and they told it to me in these horrified tones, and I thought it was the coolest story I had ever heard. The priests in my parish were not priests who were themselves, even though our church was located just around the corner, they weren't themselves involved in this kind of defiant activism where they were really enmeshed with the issues of the day. And so that sort of got me hooked on this story, and over time I sort of came to it in a roundabout way. I'd written some other books about law and religion, but I knew that I had to write a book about Catonsville. And one of the stories that I heard a lot, growing up in Catonsville and hearing this story, numerous people came up to me or in the course of conversation would say, Dan Berrigan saved my life because my draft file was one of the files that was destroyed. And it's a powerful story, and I often think that it's meaningful to individuals, but I heard that story a lot. There were only 372 files, and I felt like I personally spoke with 150 people who had done that. And this trend sort of reached its apotheosis after Dan passed away. David Byrne, who you might know, is the lead singer of the Talking Heads, published an article in The Guardian, and the headline of which was, Dan Berrigan saved my life. And the story was that David Byrne wasn't from Catonsville, he's from Lansdowne, which is right next to Catonsville. And he said, my draft file was in Local Board 33, and of course Dan and his 8 colleagues stole these files and burned them, and Dan Berrigan saved my life. And I saw that story, and I said, I don't believe you, David Byrne of the Talking Heads. I don't think that that's true. There's something odd about this narrative. And lo and behold, David Byrne was born in, I think, 1953. And you can do the math. He was 15 or 16 in 1968, thus did not have a draft file at all in Local Board 33 on May 17th, 1968. And so I contacted The Guardian and said, I don't want to be the guy who rains on David Byrne's parade, but I just don't think that this story is true. And in fact, David Byrne subsequently published a, euphemistically called a clarification later, in which he said, I guess this story wasn't true. I thought it was. It had been told, my parents told me this, and I have come to believe it's true, and isn't memory an interesting thing? And I tell that story not to call out David Byrne. His career has survived. He made it, his confrontation with Shawn Peters on the pages of The Guardian. But to make a point about how we connect with people and events, and how we make meaning of them, particularly prominent events of this kind. I think often there is a tendency to, and I found myself falling victim to this as well, this sort of mythologizing or almost engaging in hagiography when we feel something has a real, a meaningful impact that draws us in a kind of visceral, emotional way. Rather than doing the hard work and looking at the actual lived experiences of people. And doing that is really, it's complicated and it's messy and it's contradictory. But I also think that that's the most interesting thing that we can do. Whether we're individuals trying to live a life of faith, or we're just sort of interested in political action. And I want to do that a little bit when we talk about the New Catholic Left. I just want to go through that exercise a little bit. Catonsville is a great example of how maybe peeling back the sort of obvious, easy narrative and really getting at the interesting and complicated facts really helps us fully understand the totality of this movement that was called the New Catholic Left. And I'll just mention a few things. One of them is that Catonsville is often described as, it's like Berrigan's and the Seven Dwarves, sort of. It was Dan and Phil and a bunch of other people that nobody remembers. And if you Google Catonsville 9 and you click on the images, invariably the first picture that you'll see is Dan and Phil standing in front of the fire with everybody else cropped out of the frame. You don't even see the other 7 individuals. And which is interesting because Dan was not an enthusiastic participant in Catonsville. He came to become one, certainly, but in the planning and in the sort of run-up to Catonsville, Dan was the 9th of the 9. Phil had to convince him. The story that they told later was that Phil went to Ithaca and they drank whiskey all night, and finally he wore him down. And Dan said many interesting things about that. Dan was very, I think, forthright about the fact, his fears, the things that kind of held him back from becoming involved. So if you decenter Dan somewhat, and Dan, I think, comes to the fore, starting with the burning of the files and at the trial, and of course, creating the play and going underground. Dan comes to the fore more after as a sort of narrator himself. Those other 7 people, I really, if you remember nothing else about me or my book or anything else, go and find out about those other 7. The Berrigans are amazing, admirable men, and I have been fascinated by them. Those other 7 people really live interesting, meaningful, impactful lives that we shouldn't overlook. And that isn't to minimize Dan or to minimize Phil, but so I'll give you a couple of examples of the other 7. Tom and Marjorie Melville, who were Mary Knoll missionaries in Guatemala. Incredible story. I can't do it justice. They were involved with basically leftist guerrillas in Guatemala. Tom was a priest. Marjorie was in the religious order as well. They fell in love. They ran around with these leftist guerrillas and were expelled from Guatemala. Their story was so good that they wrote a book called Who's Heaven, Who's Earth. Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda were going to play them in the movie version. That's how good that story. When Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda want to play you in a movie, I think that you're an interesting person. Also, Tom Lewis, really instrumental with Phil. The Baltimore Four were mentioned. The Baltimore Four was sort of the first go-round with these draft file actions. Tom Lewis was a peace and social justice activist in Baltimore. He was an artist, was involved in racial equality issues in Baltimore as well. And Mary Moylan, who was a nurse and did aid work in Africa. And I mentioned them also. Catonsville is also often talked about almost exclusively as about Vietnam. And for obvious reasons, draft files were destroyed. In fact, Catonsville was an indictment of imperialism. It was an indictment of racism. It was an indictment of poverty. It was a broad social justice, peace and social justice action. If you look at the statement that they actually, as was mentioned earlier, I don't know if you mentioned it, they invited the media to watch them do this. They handed out a statement, and it's a manifesto of its time. If you read it, you see that holistic sense that activists of the time have. Certainly, I think Vietnam was seen as the most acute symptom of a disease that was sort of affecting the body politic. As was mentioned too, not everyone agreed with Catonsville, certainly within and both within and without the church. As was mentioned, Thomas Merton. Dorothy Day, I think her position was she supported the Nine, but not what they did at the time. And even the Nine themselves came to disagree. One of the best parts of my book is about Mary Moylan and her story. Mary Moylan later said she regretted having gone to Catonsville, and that if she had to do it again, she would have done it with her sisters. She foregrounded feminism much more later in her life, and actually viewed the Berrigans' perceived leadership as a symbol of patriarchy that she wasn't comfortable with. I'll mention really quickly too, outcomes as well. Catonsville was a movement that I think sort of solidified Dan's status as this sort of radical religious celebrity. I think it was that he had certainly been doing many things before, but I think it was the moment. Catonsville actually didn't have positive outcomes for everyone who was involved. Mary Moylan, so Dan was on the run for a summer. Mary Moylan went underground for 10 years. For 10 years after Catonsville, Mary Moylan was a fugitive for justice. And it, in many ways, being underground is hard. It's difficult. It's difficult for her emotionally. And it left her, I think, distraught in many ways emotionally. David Darst, another of the Nine, another person that no one ever hears about, actually died in an automobile accident, dealt with mental health issues as well. And so I mention that, and I mention all of these things not to debunk or challenge, but to really urge people to think, and we'll hear more about this and better coming up, certainly to use, I think maybe use the Berrigans, to use Dan as a kind, maybe a window or a launching off point to get at other individuals and other ideas. It's certainly a fantastic place to start, but I wouldn't stop there. I would keep going with those stories. And I was more or less true to my word. I didn't speak for too long, so Fred, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can take it from there.
I'm going to stand up. Hello, everyone. You know, the collage that a panel is always quite amazing. For instance, I realized as you were speaking that David Byrne saved my life. honored and privileged to be with you. And my story is much more, it's less systemic and more personal. And it really does sort of, it speaks to many of the things that you were just saying about what the complexity and the contradictoriness. And also it's a story of from the far provinces of the moral geography of the Vietnam era. And when I say that, I mean, I think of, where we are as being part of the center or part of the headquarters. And certainly, Dan and Phil Berrigan were at the center. And this story that I'm going to tell about myself is really long. It's a long time ago, but it's far away. And but it has a window into, if not the new Catholic left, it was the old Catholic left that was renewed, and well, that's enough of an introduction. I've written it up. I'm going to look at it occasionally, and at the beginning. In 1968, as I was about to graduate from Brown, I had transferred there, by the way, from Providence College and Dominicans. In that spring, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. And even today, these many years later, I am stunned by that decision. I constantly, in my bad dreams, say, who was that young person with my name? And what was he thinking? I have a running list of possible motives. At the top of it is what I said to myself back then. In my undergraduate years, I thought I had found my calling in life. I really mean that as a vocation. And that was to be a writer. And I reasoned, if you could call it such, that as a writer I was called to go to this war and write about it from within, to get it into the books, as Walt Whitman said about the war of his time. That last phrase is frightening. It's one of those enabling myths that every generation the idea that every generation has a war specific to itself. Another of my faulty thoughts, I guess. I thought history had conspired to give me a bad war to write about. But that made it seem, to my graduating mind, all the more necessary that someone record it from deep within the belly of the beast. Having described that, I want to say to you, this is really the truth. Nowadays, I want to shout at that guy. When I see him in my dreams, say, how could you be so shallow? How could you be so callow? How self-absorbed you were. Of course, that one person is not listening to a voice out of the clouds of the future, even if it sounds like me. No, the brain, the soul, the mind was not fully formed in that young man as he recklessly headed out. There are also other enabling myths at work, ideas of manhood and bravery, improving yourself, and the possibility that, and this is the one I dislike really intensely, the idea that warfare somehow teaches you something essential about the meaning of life. And I constantly, in the last 10 years, of course, have, we all encountered that. A whole cluster of myths about human beings taking the lives of other human beings. That was all there in some sort of strange week in my mind and my thinking. A little over 2 years later, in September 1970, I left the Marine Corps as a conscientious objector. I think I'm the first. I don't know. I don't. It's a matter of vanity not to look it up. There was a fellow who had a news conference 3 months after I got out, saying he was the first. So that's how I calculate this. What had happened in those couple of years? The first thing I should note is an awful lot of good luck. I will explain in detail, but let me first say I don't want anyone to think of this as a morally heroic story. It's not. It is more a story of waking up. After a year of training as an infantry officer, after a small duty assignment in the States, I had orders to Vietnam to the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. Had been stationed along the DMZ for all of the war years. It was also the very first unit that came out of the country as a unit. You all remember that people went into the war as individuals and most often came back as individuals. But the units stayed in the country, and Richard Nixon, you may remember, got elected on the idea of Vietnamization, and one of his plans or tricks was, in fact, to take out a unit and substitute a South Vietnamese unit for it. Well, I was assigned, so it turned out I was assigned to the very first unit that came out. And as I was literally getting on the airplane, a sergeant in Okinawa said, that was the transit point into Vietnam for the Marine Corps, a sergeant said, you can't get a free weekend in Vietnam on us. You have to stay here. They are on boats coming back to their headquarters base in Okinawa. I was crestfallen and frustrated with my plan, and I was assured by senior officers that I'd be able to rotate into the country in a few months after I requested that. To make matters worse, a few weeks after that, I was picked to be the Deputy Provost Marshal for the Marine Corps on the island. That meant the Deputy Chief of Police. I was 22 years old. And that tells you something, too, about the casualty rates of junior officers. The job gave me a lot of responsibility. It also gave me an office and a couple of perks. And where is our friend from Newsweek? I can't see very well. Are you still here? Oh, good. Well, I want you to know that the Provost Marshal's office in Okinawa had subscriptions to stateside newspapers and magazines. It was really amazing. It was a large unit, and I suppose that long ago they had decided that we had to be kept up to date. In any case, all of this context is to help you imagine a day late in November of 1969, or maybe the first weekend in December. I'm not totally sure of that. But it was when the first photos of the My Lai massacre were published. And they did indeed come across my desk. It wasn't Newsweek, it was Life, I think. But of course, the other magazines picked them up and so on. The massacre, the atrocity had occurred in the spring of 1968, just for the record, a month or so, I remind myself, before I enlisted. Many of you will be familiar with those photos, and I don't have to describe them, but you know the one I mean when I talk about the infant. I looked up, after looking at that, I looked up at the ceiling of the office that I was sitting in, and I declared to the ceiling, and nowadays I say to whatever was beyond that ceiling, I said, I'm not a Nazi. And that was the first baby step I took toward leaving the Marine Corps. What I felt was an overwhelming moral disgust. I disgust not only at the situation that I had witnessed in a photograph, but a disgust with myself. And of course, a disgust with a larger principle at work. I was part of a larger enterprise that produced these atrocities. I was part of that machine. Let me have some water. It would be several months later before I prepared a 90-page application for discharge as a CO. It comes as a revelation to many people to this day that the United States military has, in its branches, has sets of regulations for conscientious objection arrived at sincerely after an equally sincere enlistment. And that became the issue. And I marvel at and celebrate the concept, the perennial concept of tests for conscientious objection. Sincerity. Think about the law code involved, right? And that is what I had to do for those months. The procedures involved all sorts of interviews and whatnot. And constantly I had to sort of convince somebody that I wasn't kidding, that I wasn't trying to get out of going to the war, and I really did not want to do this anymore. It was a very inarticulate dimension of my conversation was inarticulate. Even as I found myself saying something, I would say then, I don't want to do this anymore. There were lots of variations on this. But the truth of the matter is that I was pretty alone on Okinawa in the Marine Corps. There was reports of a GI anti-war movement in the States. Everything was scattered, and the war was on, and it was really, you didn't have a sense of community that way. However, I wasn't totally alone. One of my greatest allies throughout the whole, 6 or 7 month process of making the decision was the base chaplain. His name is James F. Harris. He was himself a proud, well, not so proud, but a real product of the Archdiocese of Chicago. He was a parish priest who decided that he wanted to join the Navy and see the world. And it was in the that sort of new frontier moment of the early 60s. By 1969, he had spent 2.5 years in Vietnam with Marines and in combat. He was witness to the damage done and had changed his mind about the war and even the military. He was also a priest who celebrated Vatican II, who loved the reforms, especially in the liturgy. Yesterday, in the past couple of days, I've been listening to so many beautiful descriptions of Dan's workspaces and walls and the things on his walls. And every time someone said something about that, another image of Jim Harris's wall came to mind. Rita Katz's work, for instance. And in any case, he had a library in his office as well. And yes, of course, Daniel Berrigan's work was there. I don't remember Phil Berrigan's work, by the way, but poetry and prose. It was there. I don't remember if I first read Dan Berrigan's poetry. I may have read it before that. But I surely did read it there, and I read about him. And another great source of comfort and alliance. And that was the National Catholic Reporter. It was the most stunningly important thing that could have happened to me in that predicament. I think it was bi-weekly, and I don't think it was weekly then. It was a lot of intensity. I remember waiting for it and reading it, with a hunger that it was so great. And I'm here to say I was so glad when I learned that Heidi's job was connected. It helped this way, for instance. Aside from the reporting and certainly the moral stance, especially about the war, but about the broader social concerns. In addition to that, there were advertisements. And I saw an ad for the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectives. By the way, I should have said this, it's somewhere in there. Jim Harris was not a pacifist. He didn't know anything about conscientious objection. When I first met him, I said, Father, I think I got to leave the Marine Corps. And he said, me too. And that was it. But it wasn't a theoretical stance on his part. He was going to serve his time and get a contract, and that was that. Actually, he started an alcohol counsel service in Baltimore after he went back home. But in any case, he wasn't a pacifist, and he didn't really have a lot to say about guidance in that, personal guidance, sure, but like learning. But actually, the National Catholic Reporter did, and the CCCO did. And within 2 weeks, I was writing to them. I had a lawyer, and I hadn't done anything yet, and it was just counsel all the way, plus pamphlets. I was going to bring some, and I forgot, and I would have gotten in the way anyway. But pamphlets helped me. So there were these things. The leaflets were floating my way, is what it felt like, over the Pacific. When I first began the process, I thought my job was to get court-martialed, and I didn't get thrilled at the idea of going to jail, but I thought I'm going to get court-martialed. I'm going to disobey an order and get court-martialed, and then let's see what happens. And my lawyer in Philadelphia in CCCO said, well, wait a minute. First of all, take a look at and maybe regulation and order. And as it turns out, I was the deputy chief of police, and I had all the Navy regulations in the wall behind me, behind my desk. I looked up the number, pulled it off, and opened up the loose leaf binder and saw the procedure. And I said, okay, that seems reasonable. And if they fail me, then I'll disobey and get a court-martial. It was a slow motion decision-making and a late blooming awakening to what was real and all around me. I'm going to give you the most personal moment of decision-making that I can remember. And I'm going to read from a longer meditation poem of mine. It's called Malabowls. It was my first book, and I was kind of grand in my thinking. That's the second to last ring of hell. And I thought Okinawa was like the second to last name of real hell. Well, in any case, Malabo was that area in my mind. And this is another Sunday morning looking at the ceiling, really, in Tengan. In Tengan, in Camp Smedley D. Butler, named strangely after a general who, in disgust at the wars on behalf of United Fruit Company, turned in his medals and quit. On a thickly flowered, half-jungle hillside, overlooking the brig, in a sea of sugarcane, the escapees loved like life itself. In a white blockhouse, on a Spartan single bed, in skivvies and flip-flops, I am asking myself again, what would I be willing to trade? A part of my body, how much of my life for one poem, one line, one true word about this war. In a voice, not quite my own, but close to my face, and as if behind a fine wire mesh began to wonder just how grand, fulfilled with epiphany, a poem would have to be if the price was the arm, the leg, the eye of another. Ganesh, a Hindu deity, son of Shiva and Parvati, has a pot-bellied human torso and an elephant's head. Beloved by all he blesses beginnings, businesses, marriages, births, and in this he is also a patron of writers, an inspirer of epic poems. He might, as a small tremor, be stepping through me as he rises up out of the cane fields into clouds swollen with rainwater, and be readying himself to speak within the thunder. But even if this were so, I still claim that the thin, quick, half-audible no I said out loud was mine. Now, in those two stanzas, you can hear all the echoes of my Catholic upbringing. The voice behind the screen was from so many confessions of that era. The penance of being silent for 20 years that I thought I was going to have to pay that too. The point was, and then, and remains so now, that the work of mind and heart is to imagine the consequences of what we do to others, not only to ourselves. I was going to say, in regard to those folks who did say that Dan Berrigan saved their lives, it's always interesting, isn't it? Because he probably saved some lives of some Vietnamese too, right? And perhaps, I hope I can say this with some legitimacy, that the no I claimed was mine owed something to the broader climate of resistance created and fostered by the Catholic left of that era. In early 1968, Dan Berrigan and Howard Zinn flew to Hanoi to bring back three captured American airmen, a gesture by the North Vietnamese toward the peace activists and movement of this country, as well as the U.S. government. In the preface to the book that recounts that visit, Berrigan writes something that echoes and echoes and echoes into the present. How many must die before our voices are heard? How many must be tortured, dislocated, starved, maddened? When, at what point will you say no to this war? I have often thought I must have read that in Jim Harris's office, or in NCR, or somewhere. I'm not sure. It's one of those messy things, right? As you can see from my, I had it. I'll show it on there. I have a well-traveled copy of the book from 1968, and it's been with me and important in my teaching over the years, but it's not from that time. I didn't buy it then. I should note also that while I was waiting for Washington to decide on my case, Jim Harris suggested I teach a course in the larger brig on Okinawa, and thus began my lifelong work as a teacher. Ever since, I've taught basically the same courses. The inmates asked me for a course on world religions and a course on creative writing. And as I look back, I think, it's kind of what I was doing for 40 years. In some other words to describe what happened with me can also be lifted from my flight to Hanoi. When we're getting ready to come over, they're on the tarmac of the airport. Dan says, the fact was that because of their being in Hanoi during an American bombing, the fact was that quite simply and unequivocally, He had graduated from innocence. We stood at the airstrip that night, a degree of sorts in hand at the ceremony of our Vietnam commencement. And I would say that there's an analog in that, in my own experience in Okinawa. Thank you.
I too am going to stand. I have to because I'm Italian and I can't talk without my hands. I have to move. I also can't see. How did you do this? Well, okay. Okay, I will do it. I always do what I'm told. My name is Cookie Ridolfi, as you've heard. On Sunday, August... Really? Okay. All right. On Sunday, August 22nd, 1971, the FBI arrested 20 people inside of a federal building in Camden, New Jersey, a United States Post Office building. During a raid on the draft board, which was in that building, I was one of those people. Within the next 2 weeks, 8 more people had been arrested in connection with this action. You heard about Catonsville. You've heard a lot about what the Berrigans did, Baltimore 4, Catonsville 9, and there were many other action groups. We were certainly not the first. By the time of my arrest, there had been 9 trials. Can you hear me?
Testing, testing.
Okay. What about hygiene? Okay. We were not the first group to raid a draft board. You heard about the Catonsville 9, the Baltimore 4. By the time of my arrest, there had been 9 draft board actions and trials. There were some actions where people were not arrested. But by the time of my arrest, there had been 9. In every case, the defendants were convicted and sent to prison. So I knew the risk going in, and I was afraid of prison. But I was also 22 years old, with the passion and certainty of a 22-year-old, and I wanted to do more to bring attention to the war in Vietnam. We were charged with 7 federal felonies, crazy charges like conspiracy, burglary, carrying burglary tools on a government reservation. I don't even remember them. I was trying to remember them for today, but I couldn't remember my charges. Isn't that ridiculous? I also teach criminal law, so now I can tell you the elements of the crimes, but anyway. We were charged with these crimes. The case drew national attention. Our arrest was on the front page of the New York Times. The trial lasted for 14 weeks. It started February 5th and ended on May the 20th. It took 2 weeks just to select the jury because so many people had heard about the case and so many people came to the courtroom already convinced we were guilty. So let me just tell you about what happened at the time of the arrest. I know I hadn't planned on this, but you got to know it. This is a great story. Okay, so we go to the draft board to do the raid. There's a riot going on in Camden, New Jersey. There's race riots because a Puerto Rican man had been shot and killed by the police, and people were just upset about it. It was really a crazy time. And we were driven to the draft board, the federal building, in the back of a van. So we pull the van up to the back of the federal building. The post office is there. We get out, we look around, we put a ladder up, we run up, we pull our ladder back, then we go up the fire escape, and we go up, and the draft board was on the 6th floor, and there was a parapet around it, which means there was like this. This is a parapet sort of thing. It was a little, porch area where you could stand. So we went in there. We used glass cutters to get in the window. We entered the draft board. We had pen light flashlights, and we were in there. We had already planned the entire thing. We'd already cased the building for 8 months. I'd been in the draft board before I knew where the 1A files were. And so we were pointing them out and telling people to, you do these, you do these. And we had already borrowed mail bags from the U.S. Post Office the week before, so we were packing mail bags with draft files. And so two hours into it, I hear this sort of faint sound that sounds like FBI, raid. And I think, I got nervous at first. I thought, oh, that's not funny, Paul. I figured it was my friend Paul. He's just like joking around. So then, a few seconds later, I start hearing footsteps. And then the FBI were on the roof. They jumped down onto the parapet, and we're in this dark room, right? Because we had little pen flashlights. We didn't want to turn the lights on. So they start coming in the windows, and I see these silhouettes of men coming in the windows, and they're screaming, FBI raid, FBI raid. And they're in there, and they have guns drawn. And it was one of those moments where, had they just come in and said, okay, Cookie, let's go, you're going to jail, I think I would have died of fear. But it was so crazy. It was so like a dream. I kept saying to myself, oh my God, I have to remember this to tell it to my friends. And you. And so, they ran around and two guys grabbed a hold of me and put me on the ground, and one put his knee in my back, and they were getting rough with some of us, and some of the people who were on the parapet, they actually were throwing some of my co-defendants into the men into the draft board room. And all this was going on. It was very upsetting. My friend Paul, who had been on a lookout, came around, and he was dragged in by FBI agents who had found him. So obviously the FBI knew a lot. It was pretty clear there had been an informant in the case, which was true. At any rate, let's get back to me. There I am on the floor. The guy's got his knee in my back, and he says to the other agent, give me the handcuffs. And the agent says, I thought you brought them. And I thought, no. Just as I was getting really scared, it was like, oh no, can't be. Then, a little while later, a man comes into the draft board who at the time I did not know was Guy Goodwin, and you're too young to know Guy Goodwin, but Guy Goodwin was sort of the head person of the Justice Department who was handling all the sort of radical stuff that's going on around the country. And he walks in there and he's on a phone, and the phone's attached to a suitcase carried by this other guy, and he's looking around the room counting us, and he's saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we got them all, we got them all. So we found out later he's talking to J. Edgar Hoover on the phone around our arrest. I had no idea. Anyway, so, we were nervous, and so we were all quiet at some point when he's there and everybody's there and we're like there. They put their guns away, but we were just scared. Most people were handcuffed. They tied me up to my belt. So then Bob Williamson, one of my co-defendants, whose nickname is Weed X, it was Weed X. No, Weed X, okay? So Weed starts to say something. And let me tell you before this, we had this thing when we were practicing to do this raid, and we were going up the levee to practice climbing ladders fast, and it's kind of like the military, So we were doing this stuff, and we used to sing this little slogan thing from Paul Cummings High School. What do we eat? And then the group says, eagle meat. What do we eat? Eagle meat. What do they eat? Shit. Okay. So all of a sudden, Bob, when the room is full of us, it all separated in the room, about the size, bigger than this room actually, and each of us had 2 agents around us, and Bob goes, what do we eat? And we're like, no. And we're like, we can barely speak, our mouths are eagle meat. And then he says, what do we eat? He's speaking loud, and we say, eagle meat. And he goes, what do they eat? And we all said, shit. And the FBI got really upset and really angry, and they started dragging Paul out of the room, and they were telling us to shut up, and we couldn't do this, blah, blah, blah. But at this point, we felt a little empowered. But they're dragging Paul out of the room, and Paul's a little guy. I love Paul. He's a great guy. And they were hurting him, and I'm like, Paul, don't worry. We got him on the run now. And that made the newspaper. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry I took the time to say this story, but I just had to. Do I have glasses with me? Yeah, I knew I wore glasses. Sorry. Okay. So, The chief prosecutor in the case, this case is amazing. The chief prosecutor in the case was a guy named John Barry. And he was married to Donald Trump. I mean, his wife was the sister of Donald Trump. I swear to God, that's a true story. Right? Our president, okay? So, anyway, in Mr. Barry's opening statement, he promised the jury he would present evidence proving that we had conspired under the cover of darkness, he said, and broke into the United States Post Office building, carrying burglary tools with the intent, and that we actually were in the process of stealing draft files. After Mr. Barry's opening statement, it was our turn, and I spoke first for our group. So I told the jury, the prosecutor was right. We did break into the federal building. We were taking draft files. We admit that. I asked you to pay attention to our witnesses, our stories, so that by the end of the trial, you will understand why we felt compelled to do what we did, and you'll find that we were justified in doing so and find us not guilty. Then the government's case went in, which was pretty straightforward, and they, basically FBI agents testified, people from the draft board testified who had seen us in there. And the one odd thing is that they lied about having guns. I don't know why they did that, but they did. But they did, I know, because I was there, So when I was cross-examining the FBI, oh, by the way, we represented ourselves. We were facing 47 years, but many of us represented ourselves, not all of us. Let me drink some water. Anyway, so the prosecutor did what he said he was going to do. He proved we did it, and that we were predisposed to commit the crime, and that's an important legal factor. Because if the government had, well, never mind. I thought I was talking to my students. Okay. In our case, many of my co-defendants testified about their own lives, what led them to do what they did. They talked about their own anguish, thinking about napalm being dropped on innocent people in Indochina, how they had demonstrated and participated in sit-ins. They wrote letters to Congress and finally concluded they had to do more. In total, we had 32 witnesses for the defense. And Fathers Philip and Daniel Berrigan were two of our witnesses. But I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about just three others. First, Major Clement. At the time, Martin Luther King, who was, of course, leading the civil rights movement, was being criticized because he was saying, not only talking about civil rights, but he was talking about the war in Vietnam. And he was saying it's a civil rights issue, but it matters to all of us. But he was criticized by some for doing it, thinking you're going to detract from your movement. But he insisted on talking about it, and he talked about the fact that we were killing poor people, we were drafting them unfairly, and I wish I had brought a quote from him because he said some amazing things, as usual. Anyway, so we called Major Clement St. Martin, who was commander of the New Jersey Draft Induction Center. So he testified, he was very specific, and he described how, in fact, the selective service system systematically discriminated against the poor, people of color, and the uneducated. And he said it was common practice at the time to give medical exemptions to the sons of wealthy people. On cross-examination, the prosecutor, Mr. Barry, asked him if he thought citizens had a right to break into buildings and destroy draft files. To which he said, he paused and he said, well, probably today if they plan another raid, I might join them. This is a major military person. Then Professor Howard Zinn testified, and he began by explaining to the jury that he had just come from testifying in the Daniel Ellsberg trial. Daniel Ellsberg was one of two men responsible for releasing the Pentagon Papers to the public. They were official secret documents that laid out the true history of what was going on in Indochina. When they got published, many people in America were really appalled and upset because they realized that our government had been lying to them. They found out why we're really in Vietnam, not to save the world from communism, but we were there because of the United States' interest in rubber, tin, and oil. The last person I'm going to testify, the last person whose testimony I want to talk about is a very special person. She was Bob Good's mother. Her name is Betty Good. And he questioned her. As I said, we represented ourselves, so we called the witnesses and we questioned them and we cross-examined the government's witnesses. That was before I was a lawyer. and there's an issue. I would object to evidence going in, and you don't know this because you don't know evidence laws, and my students go, how did you know what to object to? And I said, because you just object to what's not there. And almost always I was right. So when you're studying evidence, you want to think about that. Anyway, so she testified, and she starts out by talking about her oldest son, Paul, who had been drafted and sent to Vietnam. And I'm going to read from her testimony. About 6 weeks after Paul left, we received a letter from him, a beautiful letter, telling his father really, that he should take me to Hawaii on a vacation. We had a large family, we had foster children in our home. We worked hard. Paul thought we deserved a vacation and said that he was going to take his R&R and would meet us in Hawaii. So I read the letter and I set it down on the table where your dad always sits when he gets home from work, and I went on to prepare dinner. About 2 o'clock that day, I felt a terrible sadness. And when your father came home, I told him, I think something has happened to Paul. That was Monday, June the 19th. So later in the evening, my eldest daughter, Rosemary, who lives next door, I said to her, Rosemary, how does the Army let you know when something has happened? And she said, why, Mom? Well, I think something has happened to Paul. Well, she said, I think an Army officer comes and tells you. So from that moment on, I knew that a man would be coming. I had a feeling I would see him walking up our driveway. So all day Tuesday, I had this feeling. Wednesday, my oldest son, John, came over, and I didn't want him to leave me. I wanted him to stay with me. I felt that this man was actually looking for me, but he had to leave. Then a little later, my daughter Marilyn was there cleaning out the refrigerator, and I heard a car door slam. I had to look up over the kitchen window, and sure enough, it was the Army officer already walking up the driveway. He got out of the car down the end of the drive and walked up. So I said to my daughter Marilyn, my God, the Army officer is here to tell us about Paul. And she said, what's the matter with Paul, Mom? And I said, he's gone. By that time, the man was at the door. It was in the summer and the screen door was open. When the door was open, the screen door was there. He said, is this the home of John Good? And I said, yes, I've been expecting you. So I got a little excited, and he said, now don't worry. You can call your daughter. Don't get excited, Mrs. Good. He's just missing in action. And she said, no, he's gone. So on Friday morning, I said to the children, let's go to Mass this morning. So Bobby went, and Marilyn and Rosemary went. We went to Mass. And after I received communion, I asked our Lord if he would see to it that we hear about Paul, that I wanted his body, and that I wanted to bury him beside his brother. So we got home at about 3:30 that afternoon. The Army officer came back, and he said that he would have to read his telegram or this message in the presence of my husband. So I called my husband. He came home from work, and the officer read the letter. The Army regrets to inform you that your son Paul was killed by hostile action. We waited 2 weeks, and on July the 1st, our boy came home. We had to go out to the airport. A lot of his friends were there, and they brought his body back. And I have not been able to figure out to this day how I knew that my son was killed on June the 19th. But it was after that that Bob, my co-defendant, seemed to get more concerned, as all of us did, about the war in Vietnam. And I still, even until last Friday, I still tried to hang on to the possibility, to the theory that my boy died for his country. But then I heard Professor Zinn stand on the witness stand, and he spelled it out: tin, rubber, and oil. And that's when I broke down in court. She went on. She said, I really feel guilty. I feel guilty that we sat aside and let them take our boys. Our boys were literally kidnapped, and they were taken 10,000 miles away from home, most of them just kids. And these kids are trying to show us where we were wrong. I certainly don't want to see my son go to prison, but I'm proud of what he's done. He's done what we brought him up to do. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. I know that I was. I'm ashamed of the day I took my son to that airplane and put him on. I'm ashamed of any pride that I had when the taps were played, and I did have pride in my country. And I'm proud of my son because he didn't know, a kid that never held a gun in his life, to take that lovely boy and tell him, you are fighting for your country, how stupid can you get? He was fighting for his country. Can anybody stand here and tell me now how he was fighting for his country? I can't understand what we're doing over there. We should get out of this, but not one of us raised our hand to do anything about it. We left it up to these people, the defendants, for them to do it, and now we are prosecuting them for it. Dear God. On May the 20th, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury found us not guilty. That experience has had a lasting effect on me. It's made me a better parent, a better teacher, and a better lawyer. 9 years after the trial, I graduated from law school. I became a public defender. I was a public defender for a number of years, and then I became a law professor. As a public defender, I saw the justice system from the inside, and it was very disturbing. I saw racism. I saw police officers lying on the witness stand and prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence. That's evidence that would have supported the defendant's case. And then I became a law professor, and in 2001, I started the Northern California Innocence Project, which today has led to the release of 24 innocent people who together served 303 years in prison for crimes they did not commit.